Marcus Daniels stepped into the airport with a calm smile on his face. The early morning rush had already begun, with travelers moving quickly through the terminal, dragging their suitcases, some rushing to catch connecting flights, others relaxed with coffee in hand. For Marcus, flying had become a regular part of life. As the CEO of a growing company, he often traveled across the country and around the world. Yet, no matter how many times he flew, he always carried himself with the same quiet composure. He was not the type of man who demanded attention, but wherever he went, people seemed to notice him anyway. That day was no different. Marcus wore a tailored navy blue suit, freshly pressed, with a silver tie clip that glimmered under the airport lights. His shoes were polished to perfection. He had the appearance of someone important, but he never showed off. He carried a single leather briefcase, holding his laptop and a stack of contracts he had been reviewing the night before. His company had just finalized a major deal, and though he was tired from days of meetings, there was a sense of satisfaction in his eyes. At the gate, people were lined up waiting for boarding. Some first-class passengers stood near the priority lane, checking their phones impatiently. A young couple with 2 children tried to keep the kids entertained, while a man in a business suit loudly spoke on his phone about a deal that just had to close today. Marcus quietly joined the line, holding his boarding pass in one hand. The gate agent scanned his ticket with a polite smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Daniels. Thank you for flying with us today." He gave her a small nod. "Thank you," he replied, his voice deep but soft. As he walked through the jet bridge, he thought about how many years it had taken to reach this point in his life. He remembered the long nights in his 20s when he had worked 2 jobs, trying to pay for school. He remembered the moments when people doubted him, telling him success was out of reach. And yet, here he was now, boarding a first-class cabin, not as a lucky passenger, but as a man who had earned every step of his journey. Inside the plane, the cabin crew greeted him warmly. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee, and the seats in the VIP section looked inviting with their wide leather cushions and soft blankets neatly folded. Marcus walked down the aisle and reached his seat, 1A, by the window. He placed his briefcase in the overhead bin, adjusted his jacket, and settled into the seat. For a moment, he closed his eyes and exhaled, enjoying the quiet before the plane filled with chatter. Passengers began boarding steadily. Some walked past the first-class section with quick glances, perhaps curious about the people who could afford such seats. A few gave Marcus polite smiles. He simply nodded in return, keeping his calm expression. Then came the sound of clicking heels against the floor. A flight attendant approached, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She wore a professional smile, but there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. Marcus noticed it immediately. "Excuse me, sir," she began softly. "Would you mind stepping aside for just a moment?" Marcus looked up at her, slightly puzzled. "Is something wrong?" he asked politely. The attendant glanced over her shoulder before lowering her voice. "There seems to be a small issue with the seating arrangement. If you wouldn't mind, could you just wait a moment while we sort it out?" Marcus raised an eyebrow but nodded calmly. "Of course." He unbuckled his seat belt and stood, stepping into the aisle. His height and posture gave him a dignified presence. Other passengers nearby glanced curiously, wondering what was happening. A few seconds later, another man entered the cabin. He was white, middle-aged, and dressed in an expensive gray suit. His gold watch gleamed as he adjusted his cufflinks. He walked in with the air of someone who was used to special treatment. Without hesitation, the flight attendant guided him to Marcus's seat. "This will be your seat today, sir," she said with a bright smile. The man gave a quick nod, placing his briefcase down and sitting comfortably in 1A, the seat Marcus had just left. He didn't look at Marcus, didn't say thank you, didn't even acknowledge that someone had been sitting there. To him, It seemed natural that the seat belonged to him. Marcus stood silently, watching. A few passengers in first class exchanged glances. One woman whispered to her husband, "Wasn't that man already sitting there?" The husband shrugged, uncomfortable but unsure if he should say anything. The attendant turned back to Marcus. "Sir, we'll find you another seat. Please, follow me." Marcus's lips pressed together slightly, but he did not argue. With quiet steps, he followed her to a seat further back in the first-class cabin. It was still comfortable, but clearly not the premium spot he had chosen and paid for. He sat down, keeping his posture straight. Inside, Marcus felt the sting of humiliation. He had been asked to step aside, as if his presence was less important. The attendant hadn't explained why, and the other man had shown no courtesy. It was a small act, but it carried weight. He had spent his life proving his worth in boardrooms, on stages, and in negotiations. Yet, here in this cabin, it seemed like all of that had been dismissed in a moment. Still, Marcus did not let his emotions show. His face remained calm, his hands resting on his lap. He was not a man who reacted in anger. He believed in patience, in waiting for the right time to speak. And so, he leaned back, closed his eyes again, and listened as more passengers boarded. Behind him, chatter filled the cabin. Some passengers whispered about the incident, others ignored it. The man now seated in 1A ordered a glass of champagne before the plane even took off, laughing loudly into his phone. The flight attendant hovered nearby, eager to serve him. Marcus opened his eyes and gazed out the window. Clouds drifted lazily across the morning sky. In his mind, he thought about the lesson his father had once taught him: respect is not something you demand. It's something you carry. And when people fail to give it, the world has a way of correcting them. He held on to those words, not knowing that in just a few minutes, the entire cabin would witness exactly what they meant. The engines hummed softly as passengers continued to board. Marcus sat quietly in his new seat, hands folded, his gaze steady out the window. He did not show frustration on his face, but inside, he carried the weight of what had just happened. He had been asked to give up his rightful seat without explanation. The white passenger now sat comfortably in the spot Marcus had booked and paid for, sipping champagne with the casual ease of someone used to getting whatever he wanted. Marcus had experienced moments like this before, though it had been years since one struck him so directly. In business, he was usually greeted with respect and courtesy. Executives, politicians, and world leaders shook his hand with admiration. His reputation as a visionary leader was widely known. Yet here, in this cabin, none of that mattered. To the flight attendant, he had been just another passenger who could be moved aside for someone else. The chatter around him grew louder as more travelers entered first class. Some were careful not to stare, but others glanced at Marcus, curiosity flickering in their eyes. A few whispered softly, making observations. "Wasn't that man already seated there?" one woman murmured to her husband. "Yes," he answered quietly, adjusting his tie. "I saw him sitting down before." "Strange thing to move him." The woman shook her head. "He looked so dignified too. That didn't seem right." Though Marcus heard fragments of their conversation, he did not turn his head. He preferred silence. In moments like this, he always remembered his grandfather's words: "Never let small minds steal your peace. Hold your dignity higher than their misunderstanding." Up ahead, the man in Marcus's original seat leaned back with exaggerated comfort. His gold watch caught the light as he raised his glass, chuckling at something on his phone. The flight attendant stood near him, adjusting his tray, ensuring his needs were met. She seemed completely unaware of how the situation looked to the rest of the cabin. A few seats away, an older gentleman wearing glasses observed carefully. He had flown many times in his life and could sense when something was unjust. He narrowed his eyes, watching both Marcus and the man in 1A, his mind turning over what had just unfolded. Though he remained silent, he tucked the memory away. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his hands resting calmly on his lap. Outwardly, he looked unbothered. But inside, he was analyzing. Years of leading negotiations had taught him patience. He was the kind of man who did not need to raise his voice to be heard. He knew that sometimes, the most powerful statement came from silence and timing. Minutes passed. The crew prepared the cabin for departure. Safety announcements played over the speakers, though few passengers paid attention. Many were still murmuring about what they had witnessed earlier. Some avoided looking at Marcus directly, ashamed they had said nothing. Others avoided the topic altogether, choosing the comfort of ignorance. The plane doors closed, and the aircraft began to taxi. The man in 1A stretched his legs and called out to the attendant, "Another drink before takeoff, please." His tone carried authority, as though he believed the cabin existed solely for his comfort. The attendant hurried to comply, her expression eager to please. Marcus kept his eyes forward. He did not judge loudly, but in his mind, he reflected on the patterns he had seen so many times in life. Some people walked through the world believing privilege was their birthright. They assumed seats, opportunities, and respect belonged to them by default. Others, like him, had to earn every inch of ground through years of work and perseverance. And yet, when both sat side by side, the difference in character became clear. As the plane lifted smoothly into the sky, Marcus adjusted his posture and opened the small book he carried in his briefcase. It was not a business manual or a technical report, but a journal. In it, he wrote thoughts, reflections, and lessons learned. He had started the habit years ago, finding it calming during travel. On the first page he turned to, he wrote, "Moments of disrespect are not the end. They are mirrors. They show who others are, not who you are. The real test is how you respond." He closed the journal and slipped it back into the case, his expression unchanged. Meanwhile, the man in 1A laughed loudly, his voice carrying through the cabin. A few passengers frowned, uncomfortable with his lack of courtesy. Marcus noticed the subtle shifts. People were paying attention, forming opinions, realizing the contrast between quiet dignity and loud arrogance. A flight attendant returned to Marcus's row, placing a drink on his tray. She offered a polite smile, though her earlier actions still lingered in his mind. Marcus accepted the glass with a nod, thanking her gently. She seemed almost relieved by his kindness, as if she had expected anger. Instead, she received calm gratitude. As the minutes passed, the humiliation of the moment continued to hang in the air. Marcus, however, carried it differently. To him, it was not just about losing a seat. It was about being treated as though he did not belong, even after all he had achieved. But he knew something that the others did not. Within this very airline, decisions were being made that connected directly to him. Contracts, partnerships, and investments tied his company and theirs together. 5 minutes. That was all it would take before the truth unfolded. But in those 5 minutes, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted slowly. Passengers whispered, tension grew, and awareness spread. Some passengers looked uneasy at the flight attendants, silently questioning their professionalism. Others kept sneaking glances at Marcus, surprised by how composed he remained. Marcus, unmoved, leaned back into his seat. He took a slow sip of water, straightened his cuffs, and let the plane's soft vibrations steady his thoughts. He knew the world had a way of revealing truths at the right time. And soon, the very people who had overlooked him would come to understand exactly who he was. For now, he remained patient, waiting with the quiet strength of a man who had nothing to prove. The plane cruised smoothly above the clouds, and the atmosphere inside the first-class cabin settled into a strange quiet. Passengers adjusted their seats, ordered meals, and scrolled through their tablets, but the earlier scene lingered in their minds. Most tried to act normal, Yet a silent tension remained. Everyone remembered how Marcus had been moved from his rightful seat to make way for another passenger. Marcus, sitting in his new spot, leaned back with calm control. He glanced around briefly, noticing how some eyes flicked toward him and then away quickly. People were curious but cautious. He knew the whispers would grow. He was used to being observed, though usually in boardrooms, at conferences, or during interviews, not in the awkward silence of a flight cabin. The man in 1A, who had taken Marcus's seat, continued to display his entitlement. He called the attendants frequently, requesting more drinks, asking unnecessary questions, and even snapping his fingers once to get attention. Each time, the attendants rushed to him, trying to maintain their polished smiles. To them, he looked like the kind of customer who needed pampering, the one who expected to be treated as the most important person on board. Marcus did not look in his direction. Instead, he reached for the in-flight magazine and skimmed through the pages. The glossy photos of exotic destinations, luxury hotels, and fine dining caught his eyes, but his mind was elsewhere. He was reflecting on the morning's events, piecing together every detail. It was not anger that filled him, but clarity. Years of leadership had trained him to see beyond the moment, to recognize what small actions revealed about people. Then, a calm but steady voice filled the cabin. The captain had switched on the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. This is your captain speaking. We are flying at an altitude of 36,000 feet, and the weather looks clear ahead. Today is a special flight for us, as we are honored to have an important guest traveling with us. This guest has been a strong partner with our airline and has played a key role in helping us achieve growth and success." The captain paused, letting the words sink in. Passengers perked up instantly. Whispers began in the cabin. People wondered who it could be. VIP guests were rare, and when mentioned, it usually meant someone of high influence. Marcus adjusted his jacket slowly, his expression steady. The captain's voice continued. "Please join me in welcoming on board Mr. Marcus Daniels, CEO of Daniels Global Investments. His company recently partnered with our airline's parent company in a groundbreaking venture that will help expand our services worldwide. We are proud to have him with us on this flight." For a moment, the cabin froze in silence. Eyes darted around, searching. The realization hit like a wave. The man who had been asked to leave his seat earlier, the one who sat quietly now, calm and composed, was the very person the captain had just described. Gasps echoed softly. A few passengers leaned forward to look at Marcus more closely, recognizing the name. Some even whispered details they remembered from business news. "That's him," a man in the second row whispered. "I saw his picture in Forbes. He was on the cover last year." Another passenger murmured, "Isn't he the one who made that multi-billion-dollar deal with the energy company?" "Yes," came the hushed reply. "He's one of the most powerful men in the industry." The attendants froze, their smiles faltering as they processed the announcement. They exchanged uneasy glances, realizing what they had done only minutes before. They had asked their most important passenger to step aside, to give his seat to someone else, without understanding who he was. The man in 1A shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For the first time since boarding, his confidence wavered. He glanced toward Marcus, his face betraying unease. He had assumed Marcus was just another traveler, someone unworthy of the premium spot. Now, sitting in a seat that rightfully belonged to the airline's most honored guest, he felt the weight of eyes upon him. Marcus, however, did not turn to meet his gaze. He remained composed, his eyes on the clouds outside the window. He had no need to gloat or smirk. His silence spoke volumes. The atmosphere in the cabin changed entirely. Passengers who had watched quietly before now looked at Marcus with respect, even admiration. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The man who had been humiliated was in fact the one with true power, and the one who had demanded privilege now looked small. A young woman sitting across the aisle leaned toward her husband. "Did you hear what the captain said? That's him. The man they moved." Her husband nodded slowly, his face filled with awe. "It makes you think. People judge so quickly. They don't even realize who they're dealing with." The attendants began moving through the cabin again, but their steps were different now. Their confidence had turned to nervousness. One approached Marcus cautiously, offering him a drink with a tone much softer than before. "Mr. Daniels, would you like a refreshment? Perhaps champagne or something special?" Marcus looked at her calmly. "Water will be fine, thank you." His answer, polite yet simple, carried weight. It showed that he was not interested in their sudden change of tone. He had seen their true behavior earlier, and he did not need their forced kindness now. The man in 1A finally spoke, clearing his throat. Sir, I didn't realize." He stopped, his words fumbling. It was the first time he had acknowledged Marcus. But Marcus did not turn. He let the man's unfinished words hang in the air, unanswered. What mattered most was not what was said, but what had already been revealed. The truth had a way of coming out, even without confrontation. 5 minutes earlier, Marcus had been treated as though he was invisible. Now, every eye in the cabin recognized his significance. The attendants who had once looked past him now avoided his gaze, ashamed. The passengers who had whispered about the unfairness earlier now nodded subtly, as if silently supporting him. But Marcus did not need their validation. He had built his life on stronger foundations. He knew who he was, with or without recognition. The revelation was not for him, it was for them. It was for the people who had made assumptions, who had acted out of arrogance, who believed appearance dictated worth. The cabin sat in quiet awe, the truth still sinking in. Marcus leaned back once again, adjusting his seat. To him, this moment was not about revenge. It was about patience, timing, and the undeniable way life revealed character. He had not raised his voice, not argued, not demanded respect. Yet in the end, respect had found its way back to him. The captain's announcement still lingered in the air like an echo. Every passenger now knew that Marcus Daniels was not just another traveler, not just another businessman, but the CEO of one of the most influential companies in the country. The man who had been quietly moved from his rightful seat was, in fact, the airline's most valued guest. The silence that followed was heavy. People shifted in their seats, some embarrassed, others curious, and a few clearly uncomfortable. The flight attendants, who earlier had acted with so much confidence, now looked uneasy. Their smiles felt forced, their movements suddenly cautious. They were realizing the seriousness of what they had done. Marcus sat calmly, his hands resting on his lap, his gaze steady on the clouds beyond the window. His posture radiated patience and quiet strength. He had not raised his voice, he had not demanded his seat back, and he had not asked for attention. Yet, without saying a word, the truth had placed him back into the spotlight. The man sitting in 1A shifted uncomfortably. The champagne glass he had been holding trembled slightly as he tried to appear relaxed. But the whispers from nearby passengers told him otherwise. He could feel their eyes on him, their judgment pressing against his shoulders. For the first time, his usual confidence seemed misplaced. The attendants began moving quickly, almost stumbling over themselves as they tried to serve Marcus. One returned with a tray of drinks, another brought a warm towel, and yet another asked, "Mr. Daniels, would you prefer a different meal selection? We can make special arrangements for you." Marcus looked at them calmly. "I'm fine with what you have available, thank you," he replied, his voice steady and polite. His response was simple, yet it carried the weight of someone who knew his worth and did not need exaggerated gestures to prove it. Passengers watched closely. Some admired his composure, while others felt guilty for not speaking up earlier. The older gentleman with glasses, who had observed everything from the start, leaned slightly toward his seatmate and whispered, "Dignity. That man carries himself with true dignity." Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain had already contacted the airline's senior management. Within minutes, the story had reached the chairman himself. The airline was in the middle of a major partnership deal with Marcus's company, a deal worth billions of dollars. For the airline, Marcus was not only a valued passenger but also a key figure in their future success. The chairman, alarmed by what he had heard, made an immediate decision. He instructed senior managers at the airline's destination hub to prepare for Marcus's arrival. The issue would be handled swiftly and firmly. He would not allow the disrespect shown to Marcus to go unanswered. Back in the cabin, time seemed to move slowly. Every minute that passed felt charged with tension. The man in 1A finally cleared his throat and turned toward Marcus. Mr. Daniels," he began, his voice shaky. "I didn't know," but Marcus did not turn his head. He did not need to acknowledge the man's attempt at an apology. Sometimes silence spoke louder than words. The unfinished sentence hung in the air, heavy with regret. The attendants, still flustered, tried to overcompensate by checking on Marcus repeatedly. But the more they tried, the clearer it became that their earlier actions had been careless. Respect, once lost, was not easily regained. The passengers felt the shift too. A few looked at Marcus with admiration, recognizing the lesson unfolding before their eyes. One whispered, "It's amazing how he's handling this. No anger, no drama, just calm." Another nodded in agreement. "That's real strength." The plane glided smoothly through the sky until, at last, the captain announced their descent. As the aircraft touched down, Marcus adjusted his tie and closed his briefcase. His expression remained calm, though he knew what was about to happen once they landed. When the doors opened, senior managers from the airline were already waiting near the gate. Their faces were pale, their posture stiff with nervousness. They boarded the plane immediately, speaking quietly with the lead flight attendant. The passengers in first class sat upright, realizing something significant was about to unfold. The lead manager, a tall man with a serious expression, walked down the aisle and stopped near Marcus. He bent slightly in respect. "Mr. Daniels, on behalf of the airline, I want to sincerely apologize for what happened during boarding. This should never have occurred. Please allow us to correct this immediately." Marcus looked up at him. "Your captain already spoke well of your company," he replied evenly. "But actions speak louder than words. What happened today was more than a mistake, it was a reflection of attitude." The manager swallowed hard and nodded. "You're absolutely right, sir. The staff responsible will be dealt with at once." Passengers watched with wide eyes as the managers turned to the cabin crew. The attendants who had mishandled the situation earlier were asked to step aside. Their faces turned pale as reality set in. They knew what this meant. The respect they had denied Marcus had now cost them their positions. One by one, they were escorted off the aircraft by the senior managers. The passengers remained silent, stunned by the swiftness of the decision. The man in 1A lowered his head, avoiding Marcus's gaze entirely. Marcus stood slowly, gathering his briefcase. He did not gloat, he did not smile triumphantly, and he did not look at the attendants as they were led away. Instead, he walked forward with calm dignity, every step steady and deliberate. As he moved past the rows of passengers, many gave him respectful nods. Some whispered words of admiration under their breath. "That man, he handled it with such grace. I'll never forget this flight." Marcus reached the exit, paused for a moment, and thanked the captain personally. Then, without another word, he stepped off the plane. The silence he left behind was louder than any speech. The passengers remained seated, reflecting on what they had just witnessed. It was not just about a seat, nor about power. It was about respect, dignity, and the quiet authority of a man who did not need to shout to be heard. The airport terminal was buzzing with activity as passengers streamed out of the plane. Some hurried to catch connections, others walked leisurely toward baggage claim. Yet for those who had been in the first-class cabin, the air still carried a heavy memory. What had happened during the flight was something they knew they would not easily forget. Marcus Daniels walked calmly through the terminal, his leather briefcase in hand, his polished shoes echoing softly on the floor. He did not rush, nor did he show any sign of pride. His face carried the same composed expression he had worn from the moment he boarded the plane. To onlookers, he seemed like a man simply making his way to another meeting. But to those who knew what had happened, he was walking with the quiet authority of someone who had shown the world a lesson without speaking a single angry word. Behind him, whispers followed. Some passengers spoke in hushed tones, recounting the story already. That was the CEO of Daniels Global Investments, one woman told her husband. They moved him out of his own seat, and then 5 minutes later, the captain announced who he was. The entire staff got fired right there. Her husband shook his head in disbelief. I've never seen anything like it. He didn't shout, he didn't argue, he just sat there with dignity. And then the truth came out by itself. The story spread quickly among travelers. By the time Marcus reached the lounge area, several people already recognized him. Some nodded respectfully as he passed. Others gave small smiles, as if to say they understood what he had endured and admired how he had handled it. Marcus, however, did not seek recognition. He walked into the VIP lounge, greeted the receptionist with a polite nod, and sat down near a window overlooking the runway. He ordered a simple cup of tea, placed his briefcase beside him, and allowed himself a moment of quiet. As he sat there, he reflected on the events of the morning. He thought about how quickly people judged based on appearances. To the attendants, he had been just another passenger, someone they believed could be shifted without consequence. They had not seen the years of hard work, the late nights, the battles he had fought to build his company. They had not seen the sacrifices he made, or the quiet persistence that had carried him forward. They saw only what they wanted to see. And yet, within minutes, the truth had come to light. Not because he demanded it, but because character has a way of revealing itself. Respect, he believed, was never something you begged for. It was something that naturally came when you carried yourself with dignity. While he sipped his tea, Marcus remembered a lesson his mother had often told him when he was young. You don't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes, silence is the strongest voice. That morning, those words had been proven right once again. Meanwhile, the airline's senior managers were already in crisis mode. The chairman had personally called Marcus to apologize again. His voice over the phone was filled with regret and urgency. Mr. Daniels, please accept my sincerest apologies for the treatment you received today. It does not reflect our company's values. The staff responsible have been removed, and we are taking steps to ensure this never happens again. We deeply value our partnership with you, and we will do whatever it takes to make this right. Marcus listened quietly, then replied with steady calm. I appreciate the apology. But remember, respect is not only for people with titles or power. It should be for everyone, no matter who they are. The chairman paused, humbled by those words. You are absolutely right, sir. We will remember that. When the call ended, Marcus leaned back in his chair. He was not interested in punishing anyone further. For him, the lesson had already been delivered. The attendants who had judged him had learned the cost of arrogance. The passengers had seen how quickly assumptions could be shattered. And the airline itself had been reminded of the importance of treating every customer with equal dignity. Across the terminal, some of the passengers who had been in first class noticed Marcus sitting in the lounge. A few gathered the courage to approach him. One older gentleman, the one with glasses who had quietly observed the entire flight, walked over. "Mr. Daniels," he said with a respectful smile, "I just want to say I admire how you handled yourself today. Many people would have reacted with anger, but you stayed calm. That spoke louder than any argument." Marcus nodded, returning the smile. "Thank you. Sometimes the best response is patience. The truth has a way of showing itself." The gentleman nodded again. "You gave us all a lesson today. One I won't forget." Others who passed by offered small nods of acknowledgement. Marcus returned them politely, never boasting, never showing pride. He knew the real power was not in proving people wrong but in showing them what true strength looked like. Later that evening, as Marcus prepared to leave the airport for his hotel, he reflected once more on what had happened. He thought about the man in 1A, who had taken his seat without question. He thought about the attendants, who had assumed he could be moved aside. And he thought about the passengers, who had watched silently until the truth came out. He did not feel anger toward any of them. Instead, he felt clarity. The world was still filled with people who judged too quickly, but it was also filled with moments that revealed character. For Marcus, the incident was a reminder of why he carried himself with grace, no matter the circumstance. As his car drove him through the city streets, Marcus gazed out the window. The lights of the skyline sparkled against the night sky. In his mind, he replayed the moment when the captain had spoken his name over the speakers. It had not been about recognition or status. It had been about timing the perfect moment when the truth revealed itself. By the next day, the story of the flight began to circulate beyond the passengers. Some shared it in lounges, others told it to friends, and eventually, it reached social media. People wrote posts about the calm CEO who showed dignity in the face of disrespect. Comments poured in, many admiring the way he had handled himself. Yet Marcus himself never spoke publicly about it. He did not give interviews or issue statements. For him, it was not about making headlines. It was about living with dignity, knowing that his actions had spoken for themselves. In the end, the flight became more than just a journey from one city to another. It became a story people carried with them, a story about respect, about patience, and about the quiet strength of a man who chose dignity over anger. And for Marcus Daniels, it was another reminder that the world might not always treat you fairly, but how you respond defines who you are. The seat he lost for a few minutes was nothing compared to the lesson everyone else gained for a lifetime.